can do it. What up, what up? I don't know how to use a mic. I'm less than 1 year old. How do I do it right? I've been trying to figure it out, but I can't seem to work my mouth. Fat beat, fat beat, fat beat, fat beat, fat beat. Rip it up, rip it up. Fat beat on the mic all day. Let's do it right. I get down to that beat every day of the week. My name is Riley and I'm here to say I'm the best damn rapper in the USA. I get started on the beat and I can't stop the heat. What's it coming out my mouth? I just feel the relief. Rapping all day, every day. Get a good rhyme, make it all fine. Here you go. How about that? How about them's for fat beats, huh? we gonna call that one? We did it though. We rolled out a fat beat, huh? Can we move on? Can we move on to something a little more highbrow? We're reading a letter. That's a letter from the first president of the United States, George Washington. And he's written it to a Mr. Snyder. What's the guy's name? Hold on a sec. To Reverend G.W. Snyder. And we're going to read the regular English transliteration so that we don't have to look at that kind of old English scribbly handwriting. I mean, I'm sure we can make our way through it, but it would take a while. Look at that. That just looks like scribbles. It's written from Mount Vernon on September the 25th, 1798 to the Reverend G.W. Snyder. Sir, many apologies are due to you for my not acknowledging the receipt of your obliging yeah, see, there you go. I've already lost it because my eyes aren't built for that. Favor of this 22nd ulto, and not for thanking you at an earlier period for the book you had the goodness to send me. I have heard much of the nefarious and dangerous plan and doctrines of the Illuminati. Interesting. There it is. The Illuminati, written in a letter on September the 25th, 1798 to the Reverend G.W. Snyder. This is a real letter. I'm reading this from the Library of Congress. That's what I'm reading it from. I am reading it from the Library of Congress. I am. And it's written in September 25th of 1798. So there you go. You've got something interesting here. The Illuminati mentioned by the first president of the United States were well established 20 years into the revolution. And he says he's concerned. He says, I have heard much of the nefarious and dangerous plan and doctrines of the Illuminati, but never saw the book until you were pleased to send it to me. What book that is, I'm gonna have to find out here. I'm sure there's a number 8 reference in here, so I'm gonna have to look up this book. So obviously that's gonna predate the letter, but it says the same causes which have prevented my acknowledging the receipt of your letter have prevented my reading the book hitherto, namely the multiplicity of matters which pressed upon me before, and the debilitated state in which I was there left after a severe fever which had been removed, and which allows me to add little more now than thanks for your kind wishes and favorable sentiments, except to correct an error you have run into of my presiding over the English lodges in this country. The fact is, I presided over none, nor have I been in more than once or twice within the last 30 years. So it's a big. So this letter is a really important letter because it's a big misnomer that George Washington is some heavily ingrained, Freemason guy. And this is the funny thing about these societies. It's no different than any religion, or religious cults that people will find themselves in, where you are part of some low-key small group of people that you've paid an allegiance to. You talking right over the top of me. What are you going to say? You going to say it into the microphone? And so, then there comes with that, certain rituals in order to belong to the club, and this is not, it's very tribal. And that's the thing. Like what we're seeing here is this ideological tribalism, and a lot of people can find themselves, a part of it, and even revering it and thinking it is good. And personally, I don't have a problem with that. The problem is, uh, you know, therein lies this deep-seated, um, what do I want to say? It's a rabbit hole. These things are a rabbit hole, because then you start to see how they are threaded together throughout history, and you look back and there's this tunnel, and there's all these threads, and they're interwoven, and they're tied into how everybody knows everybody. I mean, it's really what this is all about. This with these secret societies. How does everybody know everybody? And is there something that really esoteric about our unity as one being, as one human being race? And is it safe to say that the human race is united? And there are certain threads throughout history that have um, certain specific threads that have determined that no, in fact, not. There is in it's it's part of some some spiritual thing that makes us all different or whatever, and that's largely rooted in Luciferian atheism, really, because it comes down to everything about a person is strictly genetic and physiological, and the spirit is erroneous, I want to say, or that there is no esoteric, transcendent aspect that unites all beings, and which I don't adhere to at all. And but you'll see that is a common theme in the Luciferian Illuminati teaching and the Freemason, and that's really what it comes down to. Just like what you see a problem, what our everybody's problem today, I think, is theological. It's it, it's inseparable from theology, and even more moderate, patriot Americans will disagree with me because like everybody's got the freedom to believe whatever they want, and that's true. I don't argue with that. I don't say that that is incorrect. Um, Everybody's free to, but um, something that is missed is why. You know, why is it just some arbitrary thing? Is it just some haphazard? That's because there's plenty of cultures that disagree. Plenty of cultures that say no, freedom of speech is not the most important thing. What the most important thing are these ancient ideologies that take precedence over anything we could possibly think or muster to think. And so you've got to stick to this book, this code, just because it's old. It's older than us. And since it's older than us, then therefore that needs to take precedence at the expense of your ration, and at the expense of your reason, and at the expense of your will. You're to conform every action and idea to these ancient ways. And so this gets really philosophical. This is and that's really why I want to pour into this, because number one, it's historical. There's a historical record of the Illuminati. It's not a secret, and the society may function in secret, but it itself as a society is not secret, and it has existed, and just because, and it may have taken different forms now. That doesn't mean it's a different thing. May not There may not be a strict Illuminati secret society still meeting, but the spirit there is still the same, and that still is occurring, absolutely, without a doubt.
They're just, you know, but it's the same people, the same groups of people, the same families, and the same rituals. And the reason why we want to point at this is because um, of the theological implications of all this. You know, you might think that theological uh, conclusions are just all, you know, or musings are irrelevant. But that's just not the case. You know, that's a real painful self-deception, really, and I think it really ties into what we've gotten a lot wrong in this world, you know. And not saying that I have any solutions or anything, but I just want to kind of muscle through this in a public way, just to kind of eliminate a lot of the specter and you know, wonder about it all, and regardless of what the people are doing behind closed doors that, you know, aren't proven and can't be proven or whatever, and until new things come to light, you know, a lot of people can suspect a number of different things about what's going on and how or why. I just want to cover a part that's important, that's a part of my life and my culture, and particularly as an American, and how these things are moving on into the present day and still affect us even to this day, with a lot of the things that have developed through time. And oh, you found the synthesizer. So here we start with George Washington. He was concerned enough to articulate this in this letter, that there is this nefarious and dangerous plan and doctrines of the Illuminati, and it's in this book apparently. So, and so, you know, George Washington, as being an elite, he was a general of the English army in the French Indian War, and so, you know, he's no small, you know, coming from the English Empire, where generals and armies were highly respected and, you know, elevated in the community, and would have been, you know, at sort of an elite rank, you know, if you're thinking about world's most powerful people. And so he would had at least the intertanglings with the Freemasons, on account of, you know, how central Freemasonry was to English life and culture, with the Church of the Temple Church in England, which is a Freemasonic building. It's not a secret thing, you know. It's called a church, but it's run by the Freemasons in London, and of which the seat or the chair of the church is appointed by the Queen of England, and so it's a very high position, and very highly regarded, and also very kind of secret. And it's in the city of London, which the city of London is in essence run by this Temple Church culture community, and the power and the secret proceedings that occur there, and you know, which is passed off as just kind of being just like, oh, it's just kind of an old thing. We're just, you know, we're Brits here, and we just have these old things we do, and just chip off the old block, eh? And they go on with the daily thing, and they do the church, the Temple Church. We call it a Temple Church, and so, you know, really suspicious stuff, and you know, it's these images that we see in Hollywood, you know, and so, and other, it's that come up in culture, especially like in, you know, our holiday season of Halloween, and you got the images of the people, they're all wearing robes and they're in a circle and they do the dance and the song, and you know, they've got the shapes and the the candles, and there's a person, and you know, even mocked. You know, like it's it's an admitted it's also a public thing that part of the rituals that are exercised in Freemasonry are human sacrifice, mock human sacrifice rituals of in this in the case of Freemasonry, it's Hiram Abiff. I don't know if he's sacrificed or whatever, but there's definitely literature out there in order to kind of get a bigger picture. But you actually see these things come up when you look into the writings, in particular, of the Anti-Masonic Party. Now, this was the biggest kind of inspiration for me to kind of dig into this, because I'm wrestling as I'm wrestling with my place in my culture and my society, and I'm looking at history and where we're at in history, and in my place as a child of God, thinking not in terms of being anybody's bootlicker or anything, but really putting in my weight where I think that it's supposed to go according to how I understand my life in relationship to my Creator, and who am I created to be, and because I'm thankful to my Creator for the life that I have, I as a person who is thankful, wish to live a life that reflects my gratitude by putting my weight behind things that I believe and can convinced that is what that spirit that created me is doing in the world, and that for me has me at this point looking at governments, looking at history, looking at power structures, and particularly in my country and in my state, I'm looking at the history, and I'm just starting with my country. I have a a tenable knowledge of American history, and definitely have my heroes as far as American presidents go, and but I'll be honest, I have a kind of a thin thread of knowledge of the history in that regard, and so as I've gotten to know the current characters that are at play, in the White House, we got Donald Trump, and then his whole cabinet of James Mattis and John Kelly and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who's I'm a huge fan of, Betsy DeVos, and anyway, so his whole cabinet, and then a lot of the senators. I'm a huge fan of Rand Paul. I don't always agree with him on anything, but it's awesome to see him have the guts to stand up for something, and getting to know the both sides of the aisle. With on the Democratic side of the aisle, you've got Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and then in the Congress, knowing the difference between Senate and Congress, and all of the all these characters. Anyway, so I've been kind of tracing that thread back through history of there have been all these people going on in America. We should be able to see some kind of pattern that kind of gives us a clue about where we're at right now, and it's not something that people have a whole lot of fun looking at and going back and reflecting on. But for me, it's been really therapeutic, getting to know these people and their conviction and the things that motivate them. And that's where I ended up here with finding out about John Quincy Adams and his presidency, which was not a very successful presidency. But he ends up being a part of this movement called the Anti-Masonic movement, or the Anti-Masonic Party. The Anti-Masonic Party ends up being the first party to be a third party in the United States of America, with the first party being the Federalists. The Federalists then become the Democratic Party, basically at the same time as the Anti-Masonic Party. And that ends up coalescing at the election of Andrew Jackson. So basically, between these two parties, you have the Anti-Masonic party, which just ends up being the hard, I guess you call them the right. I don't know. This is the thing about this, is that the spectrums become kind of a blur at this moment, at that point, when you go back in history, because what you call things isn't so much the issue. The issue ends up just being the issues of the time, the specific policies, the specific ideas that emerge, and then the people that uh, that sort of gather around those ideas, and that ends up being those movements of the different parties and then the different power structures. And the American politics really is a fascinating thing in that regard. The money and how the money actually works. At this time, you're talking about a national bank system, and basically the thing that a lot of patriots were, cautious of at the time. In particular, Thomas Jefferson was at odds with John Adams about a federal bank, and John Adams ends up being in support of a federal bank. So does John Quincy Adams, which is a policy I don't agree with either of them on. I thought that was a mistake, and I think that really Andrew Jackson ends up being a hero exactly because of his defeating of the banks, and that really was a good thing. But this is the fascinating part about American presidential history in particular, is that exchange after Andrew Jackson defeats the banks, and then that kind of cuts the feet out from under the American economy, because there ends up being nobody to take the reins on, well, what's the kind of economy we're going to take up thereafter. And so that is one of the aspects where Andrew Jackson, even though he's a hero in this regard that he defeated the banks, when I agree with him that was a good thing that he defeated the banks, he does show himself to be a bit of a goofball, I'll say, because he didn't have this plan to recover from what that would do to the economy. A new vision, a new reality for what the American economy should look like, and so that ends up leaving a lot of people broke, and that has a lot of slave holders holding tightly to their slaves, and which, it's really a telling thing that each documentary that you can watch even points out that over and over again they'll tell you the South, their economy was in the trenches. Like, it was just, their economies were terrible compared to the northern economies because of the advent of technologies and industrialization that they just didn't have in the South. They had lots and lots of land, they had lots of slaves, but I just really see that as like the slaves were costing them. Having slaves is what was costing them, because when you have people that are working as individuals on an equal plane, on an equal scale, achieving the same things with the same opportunities, then you see a lot of people showing initiative and putting their effort in order to accomplish something really great. And then we see that happening as more and more throughout history. There becomes closer and closer to an equal playing field. And I'll agree with some people that there are things that need to be better about that, but a lot of that I think is cultural. Like Andrew Breitbart said that politics is downstream from culture, downhill or downstream. I can't remember exactly. But anyways, the thing is, politics are affected by the culture and the things that we value, and that really ends up being the realm of sorting through ideas in order to be convinced of what actually works. And so it's a tedious process, and it takes a lot of time to go through. But it's like, if we don't take the time, when are we gonna have the time? You can't make the time. You got to make the time. You don't, instead of find the time. If you're trying to find the time, you're never gonna find the time. If you make the time, then you're gonna make it happen, and it won't be so dependent on the time. It'll be dependent on you. You taking action So then we end up with John Adams, the two presidents before Abraham Lincoln, that in a slave-owning society, these two presidents did not own slaves. John Quincy Adams is very much against slavery and becomes but really before he's really an unsung hero in the abolition of slavery movement. He is cited sort of often, but in all regards, he's kind of not really mentioned. He's pretty well forgotten because his presidency was not really uh, well regarded because of certain things. I don't know. You'd have to look into him more, but I am more. This is the first photograph of him, and it was taken in 1848, I believe, and he died, I think, in 1849, famously at his desk in Congress, where he fell on the floor in Congress, and then he was taken to a place, and then he died. But this is the first picture of a president, though not a sitting president. He was still alive by the advent of the camera, basically, and which I find fascinating because he is an anti-Freemason. He is very vocal about being anti-Freemason. He was anti-Jackson on account of him being a Mason and on account of him being pro-slavery. And you'll see a lot of really interesting characters come up when you look into the anti-Mason party. But this one in particular, I say like what I find awesome about this is that here you have just one generation. You know, John Quincy Adams was the son of the second president of the United States, John Adams, who was a revolutionary, who signed the Declaration of Independence, was a big part of the first and second Constitutional Congress in Philadelphia, and so just a very pivotal character in the American Revolution. And here, just one generation removed from that, we have the invention of the photograph, and we leave the Dark Ages behind, the age of being a subject of royalty, and now you enter into the age of people can come together as one body of people and agree on how a society should be assembled in a healthy way without any rulers, but that any government is a government that is in service of the people and their will and their destiny, so to speak. And Congress and American government very much functions like a church body, and there's a lot of people that point to that civic religion. That's a coined term, civic religion, and that being how much that is mirrored by even the Catholic Church and their ecumenical councils. And there's just a lot of models to take from there, but this ends up being the first kind of secular space for people to establish government, where they're free to practice and believe in their, follow their faith. But I wanted to bring up just an example of what I'm talking about with this party, because what I see is in America and the zeitgeist and where we are now from where we are then, I'm trying to find out, what is seated back there in those first days of the revolution that might have been a poison for us that continued to this day, even here and now. And I think the first thing to really pop up, is you see George Washington's concern with Illuminati, but then you also see how this party develops um, out of some dialogue. And so I'm just going to read off of. Actually, I'm going to look up a certain character that ends up being the presidential candidate in the 1832 election against Andrew Jackson. Uh, Andrew Jackson wins in a landslide, basically. But they nominate this character, William Wirt, and he ends up being the first nominated third party presidential candidate and wins a state. He wins the state of, I think, Virginia. And he is a Freemason, but he runs as an anti-Freemason. And so then there's some talk about whether, he was in on the whole philosophy. And that's the thing, that at the time, it's sort of more seen as like a political stunt. It's not necessarily taken seriously as an honest like conspiracy. But then you see that throughout the thread of a lot of the things that get published, there's actually a very heady philosophical, theological force behind it, that a lot of these arguments that are established even back then are continued to this day. You'll hear a lot of people reciting them even now. And I want to pull up. There's a book somebody wrote. This book right here. So I'm going to read this excerpt from Chapter 5 of Wirt's presidential candidacy of 1832. And here we go. So you'll see, the first National Anti-Masonic Convention held at Philadelphia. Oh, and by the way, this is authored by a Freemason as well. So you'll see an interesting interplay between a lot of the guardians of this history of the anti-Mason movement are actually Freemasons. So they kind of wear it on the back, like as a badge of honor, like we ended up getting these people to hate us, because we're so important or whatever, But they couldn't defeat us. We ended up getting our Andrew Jackson anyways, and they're kind of a pathetic movement. With the Freemasons, the problem with a lot of people that are devoted to the Freemason ideology is that they're very intellectually lazy. I think. Especially particularly people that are kind of lower on the rung. But it says the first National Anti-Masonic Convention held at Philadelphia was on September 11th of 1830, a number that I'm sure will incite some clues to you, being that numbers and things like that are really important when it comes to these issues. As anybody you can find that anywhere. That's symbols and numbers are really important to the whole element of the society, how it functions in symbols publicly. So resulted from action taken by New York State Convention of February 1829. Not only did the Albany delegates reflecting the wishes of the State Central Committee, disavow all connections with existing parties, and resolve to hold a national meeting. But they so arranged for the site, date, and composition of the Philadelphia gathering. Each state was to send the number of delegates equivalent to its electoral vote. Selection of the date for the National Convention was no random matter. For September 11th, 1830, was for the 4th anniversary of Morgan's abduction. So that story of Morgan. And okay, awesome, thanks. We'll get to the story of Morgan. Morgan is a scenario that comes up that kind of ignites all of this. You know, there's suspicion, as you read even in George Washington's letter, that, you know, there's this malicious agenda to affect the American government and the American way of life, and that ends up kind of confirming itself with this guy Morgan abduction. So 96 delegates responded or attended, representing 10 states: Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and Ohio. One territory. Michigan. Was also represented. The necessity of selecting delegates to the Philadelphia conclave forced the anti-Masons in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Ohio to hold their first state conventions. Virtually all of the proceedings at Philadelphia were controlled by large contingents from New York. 26 delegates. Pennsylvania, 25, and Massachusetts, 15, which accounted for some 70% of the total. Convention planners had originally requested the use of Independence Hall, but local authorities denied them permission. The result of Masonic influence, the anti-Masons believed. I doubt they're very wrong about that. I'd have to look into it. The delegates first gathered in a downtown district courtroom, but this space proved too small and the meeting adjourned to the larger Music Fund Society Hall. Delegates chose Granger as president and then elected 4 vice presidents: Joseph Rittner, Philadelphia; Abner Phelps, Massachusetts; Robert Hanna, Ohio; and Samuel W. Dexter, Michigan Territory. Weed always preferred to work in an unofficial capacity, was not a member of the New York delegation, but Seward was, and he served on several important committees. New Yorkers dominated the entire proceedings, even the address to the people, considered by one contemporary to be anti-Masonry's most effective manifesto. So, was written by Myron Hawley of the Empire State. The real work of the convention, which lasted 6 days, was accomplished by some 20 committees, the most important being the committee to consider nominations. So I'm going to skip forward here because I want to get to, I know we could read on and on and on and on. I don't really want to do that to you, but I want to get to the point of who this person is and where they're at on this issue. Here's something interesting about him. Here he is. Which I think we're talking about Henry Clark. So we have. So Wirt enjoyed a substantial reputation in both legal and literary circles, although he was barely known to most politicians. Born in 1772 at Bladensburg, Maryland, 5 miles from the future national capital, and orphaned at 8, he eventually became an attorney and practiced in several areas of Virginia, settling in Richmond in 1797 after the death of his first wife. In the early 1800s, Wirt achieved national standing as a lawyer, serving as an attorney for the federal government in Burr's treason trial. So this is a dude that knows stuff. We're talking about the highest offices of the United States government. You know, so he's got, if you're talking about if you're looking, you know, these days we've got intelligence officers because we've got the CIA and the FBI stuff they didn't have back then. But if there was an FBI, you know, this guy would be the attorney to the FBI. And was in fact the attorney to the Treasurer of the United States of America. A 2-year term in the Virginia House of Delegates convinced Wirt that he was unsuited for a political career and declined President Thomas Jefferson's suggestion in 1808 that he run for Congress. Appointed U.S. Attorney General by Monroe, Wirt served longer in that cabinet post than any individual had to date. He proved an excellent administrator, devising official records and opinions-keeping systems. During this period, he developed a great reverence for Chief Justice Marshall and his doctrine of judicial nationalism. A word everybody should look up. To supplement his annual salary of $3,000, Wirt appeared in a private legal capacity in many cases before the district and Supreme Courts. He also enjoyed some renown as an author, primarily for his 1816 biography, Sketches of the Life and Character of Patrick Henry. Although Wirt obviously admires Henry's voluble, mercurial nature, similar qualities in Jackson repelled him. He considered Old Hickory to be rash, uneducated, ill-bred tyrant. By 1829, Wirt was obsessed by the idea that Jackson's rise to power demagoguery was overtaking the United States. He naively hoped, nevertheless, that Old Hickory would retain him as Attorney General, and even called upon the new president to inquire about his possibility, only to learn that Jackson had just appointed John M. Berrien of Georgia. Wirt continued an extensive legal practice, and his animosity towards Jackson increased because of the family's attitudes toward the Cherokee Nation and its struggle with Georgia. The Marylander represented the Indians in the celebrated 1831 case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. After the Baltimore Convention had selected Wirt, a committee consisting of Spencer, Tracy, Seward, and Phelps offered him the nomination. When he demurred, they told him that McLean had declined and the Anti-Masons would support neither Clay nor Calhoun, the latter because of his nullification doctrines. As Wirt observed later, the alternatives were either yielding without resistance to Jackson's re-election or presenting the nation with an opportunity to rid itself of the obnoxious administration. The committee assured Wirt that there was nothing in anti-Masonry that would make his acceptance disreputable, and afterwards he asserted that the committee had sought no pledge of him, expressed or implied. Immediately following the committee's departure, Wirt, assisted by his daughter Catherine, composed a unique acceptance letter. Something I want to read. Read the original from. I haven't seen it yet. I think it's available online, but I'll have to look around. Wirt's letter contained numerous assertions that the convention delegates, having no viable alternative, chose to ignore. He began by declaring that he had never sought the presidency, being fully aware of its fearful responsibilities, and was completely surprised by the nomination. So already you got a leadership problem. This guy doesn't really want to be the president. He's the president that people thought Donald Trump was. Somebody who didn't really want it. Oh, okay, just throw me in the mix there. Which I don't believe at all. Especially since he said over and over again, no, I meant it when I said it. I knew I would win. So, hard argument to make there when the source denies the allegation. But here, Wirt, his own words, says, I don't want this. But, was completely surprised by the nomination. He had never imagined that the Anti-Masons would nominate a former Mason who refused to wage a war of indiscriminate extermination against a fraternity, or to those the presidency to direct its power to the vindictive purpose of party proscription, and persecution. Wirt's most vehement remarks against Masonry concerned the Morgan affair and the subsequent investigation, which he said proved that Masonry had become a tremendous political force in the nation, with the power and the disposition to set the laws of the land at defiance. So this is not some hocus pocus behind the bushes thing. This guy actually acknowledged it as a Freemason, somebody who was actually a Freemason, but appointed as a candidate as an anti-Mason, acknowledges the power and the disposition to set the laws in the land of the land at defiance. That's power. They have power, and he lauded anti-Masonry for its determination to root out this noxious institution. But warned that this goal must be accomplished by legal and constitutional means, declaring that the prime objective must be to assert the supremacy of the laws. There is, in that statement, a huge philosophical implication. The supremacy of the laws. What law is going to win out here? Because, we have our laws and institutions, and we come about them democratically or whatever, and we say because we came about them democratically, we're right. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the whole of it. Clearly, what would end up being the case is that throughout time, all other options will nullify themselves, and the only viable, consistent, reasonable, rational options of what the laws are will be the thing that everything gets whittled down to eventually in time. So the supremacy of those laws are the things that are being, being fought for with the Anti-Masonry Party. And that's where I say that this party is not only revolutionary, not only ahead of its time, but something that has really been kept alive in American culture, and in particular in kind of lower class pockets of particularly church communities. To this day, Christian communities and Christian churches are vehemently against Masonry, although you'll find a lot of them are Freemasons themselves, and they'll play an act and everything to pretend like they're against Freemasonry in order to avoid suspicion by their congregation or whatever. But at the end of the day, by and large, people are suspicious of Freemasonry on a populist scale. You'll find with this, William Wirt ends up taking a whole state. I think of Vermont or Virginia. I'm pretty sure it's Vermont. I guess it was not that hard to do, smaller state or whatever, but it's still, they showed themselves to be actually a considerable threat against a sitting U.S. president, and it ends up becoming another party altogether, which ends up being the Whig Party, which then becomes the Republican Party, of which you get Abraham Lincoln, which is set up as an anti-slavery, anti-secret society party, and it continues to be to this day. And that's where I'm pointing at and saying, there is a common thread there. What is it that the salt of the earth Republican, GOP, conservative, dude there at the bottom level, the bottom rung, at the poorest level, the average middle class American, They want to see the Constitution as being the supremacy of the laws. They're against hanky-panky and secret societies. And they just want a government that's going to leave them alone and stop using their power and disposition to set the laws of the land at defiance. In defiance of the people. In defiance of common good. And so that's where I say, like people, like people like to undermine their the truth about where their heart is loyal to, what their heart is loyal to. What are you more loyal to? This fraternity of a bunch of weirdos behind closed doors doing probably some really shady stuff? Are you more loyal to people coming together and living free and, doing what they want? As long as they're not hurting anybody and they're not stealing things and they have opportunities to be the best that they can. And if you can't be the best that you can, then, have opportunity to have whatever life you're able to have in your life, for how long you got, whatever. So what if not everybody can make it to the top? It's not about getting to the top. Those people at the top, they hate their life, Not all of them. Most of them will say, oh, yeah, I love having lots of money and stuff. It's probably really great. But they had to do a lot in order to get there, and they're doing what they love. That's the thing, they're doing what they love. Is it anybody else's fault that you're not doing what you love? I don't think so. Because, that's a choice. It's a choice you make. Do you love? What do you love? How much do you love it? I know a lot of people that love being victims. So that's why I like to be on the victim team where they all recite to each other how much they're all victims. And, the only thing that makes that true is when you look at this. We are victims of a power and a disposition to set laws of the land at defiance. We're all victims to that. That is something that is true and it's documented in his history. Because look what you see happen to the Cherokee. Yeah, it's terrible. What happened to Cherokee was terrible. This guy knew it. And that's why he ran that party. And it's too bad that this American hero that really that destroyed the banks, was a Freemason, ends up being the Freemasons who then established the national bank that return us to that place of debt. Debt slavery. In referring to the controversial issue of his Masonic affiliation, Wirt admitted that in his early life he had initiated into a Richmond Lodge, but he had never taken the master's degree because of a lack of interest. He had not attended a lodge for more than 30 years, but noted that his disinterest preceded him no suspicion on my part that there was anything criminal in the institution or anything that placed its members in the slightest degree in collision with their allegiance to their country or its laws. Wirt had nothing in Masonry that would violate a person's obligation as a patriot, a Christian, and a man, and he subsequently regarded the lodge primarily as a social club designed to promote fellowship and to provide financial relief for indigent brethren. That's what most people say even today. But, he, like George Washington, never got into the higher ranks and really knew the power structure of the thing. They didn't have any kind of relationship with those people that were running it. And so as far as they knew, everything was fine and hunky-dory, and that's just how things go. Just like anybody that goes to church and they don't really know the pastors, they don't know the people that are the elders on the council or whatever. They don't know any of the people. They have no relationship with them, and so everything that happens behind closed doors is what happens, and they're never none the wiser about it. But then he said, and so he says he remarked that he was grieved by the excesses of certain anti-Masons against so harmless an institution as Freemasonry. And this is where John Quincy Adams comes and kind of clears the issue when in the way he articulates what his issue with it is, and it's really remarkable. And I'll probably get to it in another episode in the future, maybe even today. I don't know. Let's find out how long I've been going on this. I don't know why this app doesn't tell you how long you've been live, but whatever. I'll just keep going. So he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand why everybody's so pissed off about anti-Freemasonry, but he goes along with it because he sees how there's kind of a problem. He also noted, however, that the newer Masonry of the Morgan trials was not that of George Washington's day, but a wicked conspiracy against the laws of God and man, which ought to be put down. So he agrees that that's wrong, you know. Wirt warned the Baltimore Convention that justice and prudence demanded that the presidential powers should not be used for a blind and unjust prescription involving innocence and honor with guilt and treason. Wirt concluded his letter by telling the delegates that if they disagreed with his views and wished to nominate someone else, he would retire from it with far more pleasure than I should accept it. He doesn't want to be president. If they preferred to abide by his opinions, he was duty-bound to remain the anti-Masonic candidate. Although many delegates were apparently appalled by Wirt's statements, the party leadership, and that's where I think that was their... I really think this is a scene of they were ahead of their time. They didn't have the right leadership. They didn't have the right agenda. They didn't even have the right name, the Anti-Masonic name. Well, you know, that's great. I understand why they have a problem. I understand why they're trying to get at that, but that's not something to stand on, you know. That says what you're against, not what you're for. And people don't get psyched about that. They look like a bunch of, you know, as I heard Dave Chappelle say on his special today, pitchfork poor white people. The pitchfork white people. I'm sorry, dude. Dave, that was racist. That was really racist, you know. I'm poor. I'm not some out of my mind white person. I think you're, yeah, I mean, like, ignorant. That's ignorant. That's so ignorant. Like, you don't really know what it's like to be a poor white person. You really don't. And I don't. I've refused to feel sorry for you, you know, but you are ignorant. That's ignorant. That's an ignorant statement. But people want to get behind something where they know what they're for and they know what they're about and they know what they're trying to accomplish. And with a title like Anti-Masonic Party, well, of course, it was enough force to where they could actually establish something on the campaign trail, which goes to show how really forceful the party was, how they really actually had a hand in the game, a dog in the fight. And there was something to that people understood and really had an issue with. And that is what continues to this day. And that, what I believe, is what the Trump thing is all about, really, is the continuation of this revolution, of acknowledging the power structures where they really lie, how they're not what people think. And you've got to put aside that everybody can go into the same fishbowl and that because you reached into that fish bowl and grabbed out a fish, that fish is just like all the other fish. You know, you got to see how everybody is their own thing. They each have their own thing that they're after. They each have their own shtick. They each have their own ambition, their own agenda, their own reasons for getting involved with these people and having the relationships they do, whether it's for money, whether it's for sex, whether it's for power, whether it's for intrigue, whether it's for, you know, whatever their thing is that they're about, and you know, vengeance or whatever. All these spirits, you know, all of those things are spirits. Everything that I just named, that's a spiritual thing to overcome and to capture and hold captive. And if you know, depending on your agenda, and that's where the philosophical aspect comes in, because they have a lot of these. That's the way these people function. They have a philosophical principle that they're operating on that gives them their self justification to take certain privileges and take certain actions that are at the expense of other people and other people's freedoms. They believe they are entitled to take those positions of power and authority over other people because they believe that they are elected to do so. You know. So on the same day that Wirt replied to the Anti-Masonic Convention, he wrote to the chairman of the National Republican Central Committee, withdrawing as a delegate to that party's December meeting, referring to his own recent nomination. Wirt declared that no one could be more surprised than himself. A few days later, writing to his close friend and Jefferson's nephew, Dabney Carr, an interesting character, the former Attorney General, gave the first indication of his real reason for accepting the Anti-Masonic nomination, the faint hope that he might also receive the call of the National Republicans and thus might unite the anti-Jackson forces. So he saw himself as kind of a unifier. He had a transcendent view of all of this. And but in doing so, you'll find that he really what his failure is ends up being a philosophical one, where he doesn't stand on the conviction of why this why did this happen? Why do we have an anti-Masonic party now? Why is there a third party of a third political party now? And why is it the Anti-Masonic party? And in doing so, he really undermines the intellectual force behind John Quincy Adams, because John Quincy Adams articulates a very sound argument that is highly overlooked and very underread. And so we're admitted, nevertheless, such a union I do not expect, for I am too obscure and I hope too honest to awaken any such enthusiasm in this corrupt and factious age. Whether such an alliance transpired or not, Wirt expected to become a martyr during the campaign, especially from attacks by the Jacksonian press, who were no less, no doubt, in the pocket of the Masonic powers. Throughout 1831 and 1832, continued to insist to close friends that he had accepted nomination as a patriotic duty in order to defeat that despot Jackson, and he asserted that vanity and political ambition had absolutely no effect on his decision. He also told Carr in November 1831 that his acquiescence had nothing to do with furthering the anti-Masonic cause, but related to a higher goal, the nation's welfare. He's just trying to not, get locked in any corners on this, but yeah, he just is really not philosophically present. The Jacksonian and National Republican parties reacted to Wirt's nomination through their newspapers in surprise and disdain. Francis P. Blair's pro-Jackson Globe pictured Wirt as a politician who had taken up a creed at a moment's warning, and it accused Joseph Gales, editor of the National Republican Intelligencer, of having engineered Wirt's nomination as a means of ultimately selling and transferring the whole anti-Masonic party to Mr. Clay. These opinions were ignored by the Intelligencer, which expressed astonishment with Wirt's nomination, declaring the Marylander to be no enemy of Masonry in the past and seeing no change of views in his acceptance later. Gales observed that Wirt was an excellent candidate Although an 11th hour one, he could not, however, win without national Republican support. Since such backing seemed unlikely, Gale suggested the anti-Masons support Clay for president, and Wirt could serve as the Kentuckians' vice presidential running mate. Many anti-Masons expressed pleasure over Wirt's nomination and promised their support. Seward exulted that Wirt's selection produced more rejoicing in Cayuga County, New York, than any other nomination that anti-Masons could have made. Hunt told Seward that Wirt was preferable to McLean on almost every account, and he predicted that the Marylander would win even Virginia. Whittlesey confided to Seward that the choice of Wirt, although obviously the result of an accident, was the best alternative under the circumstances. He believed most anti-Masons would vote for the former Attorney General, except some for the bitter ones, who are very few. Trace, however, believed Wirt's candidacy would ruin the party. For the moment anti-Masonry becomes another term for anti-Jacksonianism, that moment our fate is sealed. That ends up being prophetic. That is exactly what that is. It became about anti-Jacksonian, anti-Jackson, not about anti-Freemasonry. And the point there ends up being, because Jackson ends up being a successful president in historical terms, but by the people's judgment. He's a really controversial figure in the modern day, but in the time he's remembered as a patriot and a hero, particularly for his defeat of the banks, particularly of which the Freemasons would return to power and totally take over American life. Wirt was possibly the most reluctant and most unwilling presidential candidate ever nominated by an American party, painfully aware of his lack of charisma. Almost from the day he accepted the nomination, Wirt realized that he had made a great mistake, and he could not win without national Republican support, which never developed. So I'm going to skip down here. Between October 31st and February 1832, Wirt accepted unsuccessfully to withdraw from the election. If withdrawal occurred, it had to be the result of amicable negotiations, for the anti-Masons had honored me, and I cannot dishonor or offend them. It would be most ungrateful and unjust. In April, he sent word that Maynard through a friend, that he had no intention of leaving the race unless he had the concurrence of the New York hierarchy. After the election, he admitted having had another reason for remaining a candidate: the fear of Clay and his friends that if Wirt withdrew, the antis would immediately supply my place with some more zealous partisan of their own, and feel increased hostility to Mr. Clay, whom they would blame for my desertion of them. And he would have been right. So he ends up worried and sick about it. And so he doesn't really have a real strong campaign, because he says Wirt later admitted in the canvass, I took no part, not even by writing private letters, which on the contrary I refused to answer whenever such answers could be interpreted into canvassing for office. Disregarding the advice of the Telegraph's editor, Duff Green, who had told them. So, you see a campaign that just doesn't try very hard. They don't put in any effort. He had a real concrete ideological force behind him, and he didn't take it up. He practically handed over the election to Andrew Jackson, whom he could have defeated if he'd put any effort in. That goes to show, like, these campaigns, who wins or loses, largely has to do with who's going to put in the effort to maintain good PR, basically. And that has to do with not just an outward appearance, but an inward appearance. How really who you are behind closed doors. I think Jackson really was who he was behind closed doors. He was in public. He was a master of a lodge. I don't know of any real conspiracy that he was some kind of weird hanky-panky dude when it comes to the Freemasonry stuff, but he was definitely a Freemason, and but he's also somebody who acted publicly who he was inwardly. But during the campaign, word did attack Masonry with vigor. So but to the dismay of the anti-Masonic friends, none of these sentiments was publicized. To Richard Rush, who was a general, the Marylander commented that Masonry was doomed if the anti-Masons remained cool and judicious. He believed that, and there he's right. Just like I was saying, if they just remember like cool and judicious, not really pointing to the force behind, what the reason that this movement comes up. If you just keep it cool and just play it cool, they're not going to win. Masonry was doomed. Oh, no. He says the Marylander commented that Masonry was doomed if the anti-Masons remained cool and judicious. So that's where I'm sorry, I disagree with him. That's where, that he shows his hand there, so to speak, that he's just thinking like, oh, it's kind of like the libertarians are today. As long as we just stick to our, libertarian values, then we're sure to win on, on purely ideological grounds. Remain cool and judicious, and then people will catch on. Like, no, they like to see fireworks. They're like zombies. They go where the light and sound is. Meh. Sheeple. The sheeple. And that's where like they're kind of, He believed that Masons had pledged themselves to the overthrow of and this is the reason why I pulled this up. Here's what he believed. He believed that Masons had pledged themselves to the overthrow of good government in the United States and harkened back to the Illuminati conspiracy of 1798, where it declared that the avowed purpose of Masonry was the creation of an international order ruled from Europe. I'm gonna read that again. I mean, that's huge. It says he believed that Masons had pledged themselves to the overthrow of good government in the United States and the harkening back to the Illuminati conspiracy of 1798, the Morgan conspiracy, where it declared that the avowed purpose of the purpose of Masonry was the creation of an international order ruled from Europe. This is a letter that I haven't gotten my hands on yet. I haven't actually seen the source document. This is something that I'm going to be probing the Library of Congress on. And we're going to be bringing more stuff like this to the forefront, reading it here on this page. And you're going to actually look at sources on where these ideas come from, where these conspiracies come from, and look at how it goes all the way back to the foundations of this country. This is not some new phenomenon. This is not some wild, I can't believe you would think that. It comes up again later in 1888 and in the end of the century in the 1880s. That there is this conspiracy still of Masons and their power and control, of the power to affect the laws of the land at defiance, and remains to this day. And so that's where people want to look at what's going on here with the Trump revolution. This is where to look. It was born in the back alleys of YouTube conspiracy theory videos and reading up on people, learning characters, learning the relationships, learning the power structures, learning about where the money actually goes. Who is the 1%? Who are the actual 1% that owns, and what is it that they own? What is the size of their wealth, really? And that's where we're gonna delve into this a lot more, and this is gonna become a lot more of a mission for me. And we're going to continue to dig at these sources and look at these things that are public. This is history, and this is history that's very rarely looked at. I mean, hardly anybody really cites this kind of material. But there you go. It says he also believed that Masons also contemplated in establishing black lodges in the South, which they would use to terrorize their white enemies. Does that not sound like exactly where we are today? Exactly. I feel like I'm reading a news article that just came out yesterday. Word declared a vowed purpose of Masonry in the creation of an international order ruled from Europe. What does that sound like? What does that sound like? He further believed that Masons also contemplated establishing black lodges in the South, which they would use to terrorize white enemies. What does that sound like? Does it sound a little like a gang to you, maybe? I think it might. Why is it they're obsessed with colors and signs and hand signals? Is that an accident? Does that have something to do with some... I mean, it sounds awful Masonic with their hand gestures and hand signals and hand shakes. What does that sound like to you? Masonic lodges were mere nonsense, unnecessary, and revelry, a rendezvous for low and vulgar dissipation, which every decent and respectable man has long since retired. For who can bear to find himself continually elbowed by blackguards and hailed by the Masonic signs in the streets by drunken, dirty, staggering, and stinking vagabonds who are a disgrace to society? Those are Wirt's words. So not so pro-Mason. In addition to Wirt's private attacks on Masonry, there were, of course, the public barbs in the anti-Masonic press aimed at Jackson, who was still an active Mason and a past Grand Master from 1822 to 1824. So a couple of years, doesn't mean much, And that's where you see that kind of borrowed from into Mormonism in the Mormon Church and the Latter-day Saints with Joseph Smith, who was a Freemason. A lot of things borrowed from Freemason. That's public knowledge. It's not really a secret anymore. It probably was at one point, but not really anymore. But a thing I want to move on to before I continue, so you can go ahead and read that. It's called that book, The Anti-Masonic Party in the United States, from 1826 to 1843, written by William Preston Vaughn, Louisville, Kentucky, University Press of Kentucky, 1983 is when that book was written. So we got to keep kind of digging back into a lot of this material that is written. We need to get a lot of original sources. But before we get too much further into William Wirt, we don't really need to dig much more into him. I want to look at kind of the more forceful ideological components behind this movement by citing their reading material. So we're going to look at this newspaper. It's called the Anti-Masonic Inquirer. And I'm just going to click on that first link, PDF, Anti-Masonic Inquirer, Monroe County Museum, County Library System. So this is in the library at Monroe County. And here we go. Let's try to find an article here. Zoom in on it. I need to escape out of that. So by Weed and Sprague. The name Weed sounds familiar. So, it starts off with a bunch of ads. I think this is the article. It starts right here. Yeah, pretty sure. Yep, that was it. I'm going to go ahead and read this article. And you can look at other articles that are available in the public. I don't know how many are. It's probably something that I'm going to spend a lot more time doing. Come on now. Okay, it's not going to let me do this full screen. It's confused. So, all out of whack. So this, has several editions here. Volume 3, number 4, number 7, 10, 19, 20, 21, 26, 34. So we're in the year 1830, which was the year that they started here. And so we're going to dig into this. Read the revised statutes number 14. Says the third chapter of the third part contains several provisions, general courts of justice, and the duties of certain officers. All courts are to be open to the public. No one can sit as a judge in a cause in which he is interested or in which he would be excluded from being a juror by reason of affinity. So, that's pointing at something there. There's a reason that they're pointing that out, because this is kind of how it functions. The secret societies, it's a secret. We have a tie. We've got a deal. I need you to serve as a juror on this case because I need this guy to get off so that we can keep our game going. Nor can he decide a cause that was argued when he was not present, or which had been before determined by him as a judge of any other court. A judge cannot practice in his own court except where he is a party, and no judge can have a partner practicing in the court of which he is a judge or be interested in the costs of any suit brought in his court. No judicial officer can take any compensation for giving advice in any matter pending before him, or of which he can take cognizance, or for preparing any papers in any such matter, except where fees for the services are provided by law. Courts can be opened or transact any business cannot be opened or transact any business on Sunday except to receive a verdict, but single magistrates may exercise their criminal jurisdiction in cases provided by law. Proceedings are not to be discontinued by the failure of any stated term of a court that are to be continued for the next term, and process may be tested on the first day of the term that should have been held. This is not the article I was reading. I read a really awesome article. I wonder if this has to be the one. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's start reading from right here. From Ward's Review. Anti-Masonry seeks the arena of politics. Political anti-Masonry coming from the Great Lakes to grapple with the gigantic offspring of London corruption, asks no leave, constitutionally, to level the lodge room with the earth, to set up a gallows of the timbers, and to hang the impostor in his own cable tow. When the knot pinches, the traitor cries out. Anti-Masonry uses politics as Christianity used miracles, not to make converts, but to gain attention. The glorious exhibition of divine power in curing the the maimed, and the blind, and stilling the tempest and raising of the dead, were not the end of our Lord's mission, but they were the means used by infinite wisdom to induce busy men to study his character and to keep his commandments. It was Simon Magus who became converted by miracles. It is remarkable that the multitudes who had not taken heed to the Sermon on the Mount. So this is a criticism of the Anti-Masonic Party in an Anti-Masonic paper. This is the Anti-Masonic Inquirer. So they're kind of pointing out kind of like, what's the thing that's supposed to motivate this movement? And here he gets super theological. So something that's actually echoed in this is a character that comes up in a book that I've been reading on the Good Godfather channel, which is the Recognitions of Clement, or the Apostle of, or the Acts of the Apostles, the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles. That's what it is. And so they bring up Simon Magus, who became converted by miracles. It is remarkable that the multitudes who had not taken heed to the Sermon on the Mount were swift to join in the shedding of innocent blood, while thousands afterward, imbued with the doctrine of the cross, laid down their lives in martyrdom. He that becomes anti-Mason for the sake of politics is a Simon Magus. But he who... So this is a spiritual movement. He's pointing to this is a very esoteric theological thing. But he who, in admiration of its political sway, extermines its doctrines, will suffer martyrdom sooner than abandon its principles. And that's where I think William Wirt just doesn't have the conviction behind him. Like, it was really a bad candidate. If the people about the praises of anti-Masonry only for the power it displays, woe to the party. Power it has, but power is a slippery tie to hold together the throng of a great people. It has in itself a repulsive property, dangerous to its own existence in republican government. Breaches occur, opposition arises, in the party by its own force is severed and broken. Principle alone can be relied upon. Principle alone can be relied upon. Principle alone can be relied upon. Thoroughly imbued and intimately incorporated jealousy of all secret combinations, whether they conceal or exalt themselves. This principle, political anti-Masonry, induces men to study. It brings home to the voters of our country the question of the tendency of the secret societies. And when that question is understandingly just, they will decide against the mystic brotherhoods of every name with overwhelming majorities. And that's the truth. That's the truth. They knew what they were doing. This was not publicized enough. It wasn't put enough in people's faces as to that this thing was going on. I mean, we don't even hear about it until now. It's like 200 years later, 150 years later, whatever. With overwhelming majorities, all men in this country are political. Anything connected with politics will be generally canvassed. If it be dangerous to our free institutions, the reprobation of a free people will be stamped upon it. If it be good, it will outlive its foes. We are willing to submit free Masonry to this ordeal. If it abide the trial, well, otherwise let it perish. The wonderful vigor of the cause in the political world is the best hope of those who aim at the destruction of Freemasonry. The array of votes is sufficient to stop the mouth of falsehood, but anything short of the official returns does not prevent honorable and intelligent guardians of the public from announcing the entire composure of the public mind upon this irritating subject. Indeed, the official returns do not prevent the acting governor of the state of New York from commencing his annual message to the legislature with assurance that such feelings, hostility to Masonry, cannot long exist beyond the limits of their proper sphere of action, and it is a source of gratification that in this instance they give evidence of speedily subsiding into their natural and healthful channels. The limit of the anti-Masonic sphere is social discipline, according to the message in the political discipline, which returns 30 members to the Assembly of New York in 1830, where it returned 15 in 1829, is not healthful but subsiding. The governor was napping when he wrote that paragraph, or the preparation of it cost him abundance of trouble, and his wishes mastered his judgment, so far as to make him publish a most glaring error against truth and anti-Masonry. Every man who reads the newspapers, even the Argus and the Inquirer, must see that anti-Masonry is overflowing on every side those limits which the governor has fixed for the natural boundary, and it is by pointing to the votes officially recorded and the visible to every eye that we are able to withstand the torrent of Masonic hypocrisy and lies. At the polls, anti-Masonry feels its strength and it rejoices. If any join it merely for its political sway, they are despicable. But if any meeting its victories in New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont fail to acquaint themselves with the cause of its great power and adopt its maxims, they are neither politically wise nor fearlessly patriotic. The display of miraculous power in raising Lazarus did not convert the Jews, and the astonishing vote of 51,000 for anti-Masonry in Pennsylvania will not make a single Freemason renounce. It is not expected, but if men in their senses can behold these things and fail seriously to inquire what they mean, they are faithless to themselves and to their generation and to prosperity. It makes prosperity. That's funny. I mean posterity. It makes the patriot shudder to view the headlong race of our own beloved country in the mystery of Freemasonry. The Americans are men liable to the frailties of human nature. It is not only Frenchmen who are capable of corruption in principle. The same degree of cold in America and France marks the point at which water freezes, and the same schools of immorality which poisoned every fountain of sound principle in the agony of French Jacobinism. So Jacobinism ends up being the kind of cultural manifestation of what the Illuminati agenda is, and it's strictly French. It's and it kind of is tied to the whole French Revolution. So even in this time, and it's even regarded in some, I think, John Adams writings, and even Thomas Jefferson talks about how the Jacobinism and the French Revolution are kind of tied together, and those things are all tied to the Illuminati agenda, which ends up with the Illuminati established by Andrew Weishaupt, ends up being this movement to take over all these Freemason lodges and get them in on the action of what they're trying to accomplish as a secret society. With equal certainty, will and do poison the pure fountains of American liberty. How has the falsehood grown? I mean, this is bad. This is 170 years ago. It's 180 years ago. Almost 190 years ago. Yeah. Yeah, 188 years ago. They're saying this. Did you think it went anywhere? No, it didn't. It didn't go anywhere. The imposter strengthened itself. The pander fattened upon the time and innocence of the unsuspecting. How has the pride of Freemasonry increased, its impiety swollen, its offenses multiplied, and its murderous arm been stretched out? Not before, but since the lesson of suffering France, not among the blind populace, but the enlightened Columbia, not in degraded Africa, but in free America. And when we attack the deceiver, do not, friends, warn us to be still. Warn us that our business will suffer, that our character is lost and ruined. Has it come to this? Is an honest reputation sunk by speaking truth to the shame of Freemasonry? Must the public press be tongue-tied and the efforts of freemen be pitifully calumniated in favor of Freemasonry? Must official power be used and the influence of the government be bent to support this cup of madness sweetened with folly, that it may be most respectfully presented with all its curses and its oaths to the lips of the rising generation? The omen of 5 states with loud voices already say, no. And this is but the first rumbling of the earthquake that will tumble the pillars of the mystic temple to the earth. Let all who will not share in the fate of Philistia's lords escape and not look beyond. Yeah. I can be done now. All right. So heavy words, heavy stuff, and glad to be bringing this to you here today. And I'll prepare a lot more stuff for the future, but I'm gonna keep digging into this and keep making it available topic of conversation, and we'll keep pouring over more of these source documents, and then slowly over time we'll get to kind of where we're at here in the present. Anyways, in the meantime, thanks for watching here today. God bless you.